So friends, for today's video, I wanted to do an if you like this, try that, specifically for if you like these fantasy romance stories, you might like these fantasy stories. And I've found a lot of times there are books that are recommended if you like fantasy and you're trying to get into fantasy romance. And then if you like fantasy romance and you're looking for more things, it's often other fantasy romance stories, but I've not found it structured in this way as often. And I know a lot of people who pick up fantasy romance love it for all of the reasons that fantasy romance is so popular, which would be the great ways in which it depicts how we go through trauma, how we heal from it, the arcs of the characters, relationship building, not just between characters and their love interests, but building familial bonds, having that found family. There's just so much to fantasy romance that's so appealing to a lot of people. But sometimes fantasy romance readers, you love so much of what makes fantasy romance popular, but you also kind of crave a little bit more of the fantasy elements specifically. And so that's why I wanted to structure it in this way where we're going from fantasy romance to fantasy, not because I think one genre is better than the other or anything like that. I certainly tend to gravitate toward fantasy more than fantasy romance, but of course both genres serve a purpose. They tend to tell certain kinds of stories and have their focus locked in a certain area, and I just wanted to provide these recommendations if you are interested. The way I'm going to go about it is I'm structuring it where the first recommendation, as I will have 3 for each of the fantasy romance books, the first one is going to be, in my opinion, the most accessible or maybe the most fantasy romance leaning already. And then as we get further, they're going to be maybe the ones that have bigger worlds or more specific, very hard to decipher kinds of political structures. And oftentimes the magic system is going to be a little bit more difficult to follow. That way, if you want to plunge into the deep end and just go for those, you'll know it's going to be the third ones that I mentioned. For the fantasy romance books, I'm going to go in order from least popular to most popular, although all of these are incredibly hyped. And we're going to start with the Bridge Kingdom series. Some of the things that stand out to me about Bridge Kingdom is, first off, it's political. It's not really got a huge emphasis on the magic system, and the world itself is not necessarily the main focus. It's not like it has a world that feels like a character in and of itself. It's not quite like that. It's much more about the fact that you have these two characters that are, in a lot of ways, true enemies to lovers, and you're seeing the ways in which they have to deal with each other as a result of an arranged marriage, and the political elements that are tied into that as each person's trying to figure out what the other person's trying to do, what they're trying to gain. They don't trust one another, but maybe they grow to trust one another. But then also they always have their own purposes at heart. And so the first recommendation would be Castles in Their Bones. This is kind of like if you took the Bridge Kingdom and then you fractured it into 3, as you are following 3 sisters. They are triplets, and they are all married off to these various different places with the end goal of having their mother have them be trained on how to make each of these places crumble so that eventually she can swoop in, take all of them over, and then rule as empress over all these places, which if you've read The Bridge Kingdom, you can see some parallels already between how the main character in that has been trained by her father. And then with each of these 3 different sisters, they each are walking into completely different environments, not just from their own, but from each other. So it's like you're getting 3 different settings, and they all have very different personality types, and then they also have to tackle very different political structures. So I think if you like The Bridge Kingdom, there's some pretty obvious overlap between these. And sometimes the characters, maybe the people that they're married to, they actually genuinely like. Sometimes they don't really like them that much, or maybe they don't like a family member within this new court. So there's a lot to dive into that I think political fantasy is just so much fun in general, and you're probably going to have some things about the Bridge Kingdom present in this as well. After that, we have Warbreaker. There is a pretty big jump, I will admit, between Castles in Their Bones and Warbreaker when it comes to the level of intensity with the magic system. However, we do once again follow a character who's been taught from a very young age about how she's going to behave when she fulfills this marriage alliance, and they're trying to ensure peace. She is not going in with the idea of trying to steal secrets the way you see from Lara in the Bridge Kingdom. However, Vivenna is the character's name. She has been taught to be this perfect person based off of the ideals of this place that she's going to be married into. However, the father of Vivenna just cannot have her fulfill the marriage alliance, so he sends another of his daughters in her place who is not prepared whatsoever. So then Vivenna goes on a rescue mission, and then the other sister, his name is Suri, she now has to try and determine everything on her own from scratch in this new court that she's not accustomed to. So it's basically like, what if Lara was clueless in the Bridge Kingdom? And what if there's a lot of things going on in the court and you're trying to piece the mystery together? And then Vivenna's trying to launch a rescue mission, but she doesn't know what she's doing. She's not that kind of a hero by any means. That's not where her skills lie. And so you see this sort of sisterly bond despite the fact the sisters aren't together. You also have a lot of court politics and characters that are more entrenched in that, which is a lot of fun. And if you're unaccustomed to really intense magic systems, I actually think this is a pretty great one to dip your toes in to see how much you really like, because the magic system is so cool. There also maybe is a hint of a romance in Warbreaker as well. The last one for the Bridge Kingdom, though, is if you don't care about romance really at all, you want all the politics, I can't think of a book that is more politically heavy than the Goblin Emperor. This is a standalone, as was Warbreaker, so at least there's that. However, in the case of the Goblin Emperor, this is very demanding. Not because the magic system is anything near what it is in Warbreaker, it's more so just that there are different races of fantasy peoples, including our main character, Maya. He is a person who is half goblin, half elf, and he is living within a kingdom that is primarily elven, and they look down on goblins. He is of noble birth as a result of a marriage between his father and a woman who is from a race of goblins, hence his birth. And that was just to fulfill an alliance. He's a product of that. He lost his mother at a young age. He loved her dearly, and he sort of just exists. His father isn't a part of his life, however, because of decorum, you could say. He still has his son Tot, and he lives in relative luxury, but he's very lonely, and he really has a sad life. It's actually quite devastating, but something happens to not only the father, but every other person that's in line for the throne before our main character Maya, and then Maya suddenly is finding himself not only having to deal with what was possibly a murder, but he is now the emperor, and he is in charge of ruling over everyone, and there are so many people that want to try and use Maya for their own gain, and they want to pull him like a puppet, and so he's trying to discern who is his ally, who's his friend, and who's his foe, on top of also wondering if there are other things at play that led to the death of all these other people. The actual political elements to the story are very difficult to follow because, one, the fantasy names are intense. Some of the most intense I've ever seen. Really, you're jumping super into the deep end if you pick up the Goblin Emperor. But the politics are so good in that it really captures that feeling of, oh my gosh, there's so many people I have to keep track of. There's so many things I have to do. There's so many... I swear that person was talking to that person, which makes me think that what they told me isn't true because that person wants something different. And you're trying to piece together all these things. There's so many names thrown at you. And the reason I think this is great is because I think it actually truly captures how much Maya is out of his element. Because you as the reader are like, what the heck's even going on? And Maya is too, so that you're kind of right there with him, and he's so sweet and genuinely pure-hearted, and you're like, oh, I just want to be his friend. I just want to help him through all of this, but he's like actually in danger, and you just feel for this character so much. I absolutely loved him, and if you're really wanting to go for extreme political fantasy, the Goblin Emperor will get that for you. Next fantasy romance book we have would be Serpent and the Wings of Night. The things that I'm specifically locking into with this one would be the extremely high stakes, as well as that more competition-centered type of story. And there are other elements too as we get into the 3 recommendations, but those are the main 2 that I wanted to zero in on. So first up we have Queens of Renthia. There's not necessarily a competition setting in this, but there is a training element to the story that is very significant, as the way this world works is you have this amazing forest setting that feels incredibly alive, and in some cases you could say literally is within the context of their world, as there are these spirits that, when not held in check by the queen's magical powers, they unleash extreme violence on the citizens of this forest realm. And the reason they do so is just instinct to protect the forest, and they feel by humans living within it, they inherently harm the forest. So they are kept in check, as I said, by a queen with magical powers. However, when that queen is starting to fade with her magical capabilities, or when she's going to die, passes away, there is this period of time where it is chaos, and they are looking to find somebody because they just know that the spirits are going to come out and really hurt a lot of individuals. So there is this sort of school setting where they're trying to find the next woman who is going to be the queen. Our main character is somebody who has witnessed firsthand the atrocities that the spirits can commit. And as a result, she wants to try and harness her capabilities and her magical prowess. However, she's not among the best of the best. She's not really all that great at magic. She's kind of average. So the people around her at this school setting are great. However, she is sort of just somebody who's trying her best. And so you follow her as she is progressing through this very dangerous world while maybe investigating if there's a little bit more going on with the spirits, as what she witnessed shouldn't have happened if the queen supposedly has a firm grasp on her powers. The high stakes are certainly present in both of these, as obviously in the Serpent and the Wings of Night, you're looking at a character who is a human among vampires, so she already is at a disadvantage, which I think means the protagonists do share that in common with each other. However, on top of that, it's not just the fact that the stakes are so high, it's the fact that you have this character who is surrounded by danger. At any moment, there can be something that goes wrong that can instantly end the character's life. And I think it's not just a matter of stakes for everyone, but those personal stakes and the danger that the character is in at all times is something that I think you feel throughout both Serpent and the Wings of Night and Queens of Renthia. The second recommendation would be for Immortal Longings. This is one that I think it just hasn't found the right crowd, but if you like that deadly competition type of story, and there's a hint of edginess, because I do think Wings of Night, has a hint of edginess to it, this one does as well. Obviously, Serpent and the Wings of Night, vampires are kind of the more paranormal element to this. Within this story, there's this unique ability for characters to launch what is basically like their soul into another person's body, and then they can control that, and there's a lot of rules as to how you can do it, who can do it, and what happens when you leave your body, and what happens if your body is killed while you're in somebody else's body, or what happens to that person whose body your soul is within. If they die, are you able to get back into your body? And there's all these different things that go into it. And our main character is somebody who, she's entering this competition with a bunch of people who have the ability to use this power. And it would seem like she does too, but she refuses to use it. So she's automatically, it would seem, at a huge disadvantage to everyone else. And you're kind of wondering, why won't she use this power? What is going on? What happened in her past? And I think there are some mysteries when it comes to the Serpent and the Wings of Night. I'm going to call it a duology because I do think that the main character's arc kind of is complete after those first two books. And I think there are certainly elements to the main character in her past and the people that she was related to or that raised her. There's some things about that you uncover throughout the story that I think you uncover as well with the main character in Immortal Longings. And then the last recommendation is technically sci-fi, but I think there's a lot of overlap between fantasy readers and this particular story, and that would be Red Rising. I think Red Rising is easy enough to get into, but I do think that the writing style is not quite the same as the Queens of Renthia or Immortal Longings. I think those ones have a more inviting writing style, whereas this one is, it has a tendency sometimes for some navel gazing, so it really thinks about itself a lot of times. But regardless, within this first book, you also have a deadly competition, and in this instance, if you don't know, the setup for Red Rising is a futuristic society in which we have a class system broken up by color. Our main character is part of the Reds, who are very oppressed. Specifically, the people at the top are the Golds, and he has an opportunity, our main character Darrow, to infiltrate the Golds and try and bring the color system, the caste system, down. And as a result, you have a character who is surrounded by people with a lot more knowledge, a lot more expertise, and a lot more connections than he has. And I do feel like that feeling is present in Serpent and the Wings of Night as well. Next up, we have From Blood and Ash. So there's a couple elements to this that I wanted to focus on. One being sort of that coming of age, finding yourself. You were sort of kept away from the rest of society and now you're entering into society, so it's sort of coming of age, but even more so, as you're not just discovering yourself, you're discovering your place within the world that you didn't previously know all that much about. The first recommendation for this would be This Vicious Grace. This one definitely has the most crossover if you really still want romance in your story, as there is a cute love story within This Vicious Grace as well. But this one is in a lot of ways like what if From Blood and Ash was young adult and maybe a little cuter and less spicy. But this one is more found family, and our main character, truly, the stakes are quite high, as she is somebody who is a magic user, and it is expected that she is going to be able to amplify her future husband's powers to defeat what will eventually be this onslaught of these monsters. However, currently, the people that she has married, when she goes to enhance their powers, she ends up killing them. So she is kept away, kept in safety, because nothing can happen to her. She's the chosen one. However, they're also looking for who her husband is, who can actually handle her making contact with them. And on top of all of that, there are also people wondering, maybe she's not the chosen one. Maybe this was incorrect here. So maybe we should take her out and put somebody else in her place, because we gotta hurry, because this onslaught of monsters is gonna come eventually, and we need to deal with this. So she's in danger. There's high stakes from the start. However, she's kept away from pretty much everybody in society because she is seen by some as this holy figure, and she's in danger. So she decides she needs somebody who she can trust is always going to be on her side, and she hires somebody to be her bodyguard. You can see some parallels if you've read from Blood and Ash. But there is a sense of found family as she gets to know other people, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to solve this problem together. The next two definitely don't have romantic elements to them. It's more so that feeling of being put out into the world and then suddenly having so much placed on your shoulders. So the first one of these two would be The Magician's Daughter. This is a story about a girl who was found on this island by this man who decided to raise her as his own daughter. And he is clearly somebody with a lot of magical prowess. He leaves the island fairly often, however, our main character does not. But it would seem the barriers that protect them on this island are starting to fade, and the father figure is somebody who perhaps has some shadows lurking in the corners waiting to come out. So as soon as the barriers are fading, they're in danger. He then finally sort of introduces our main character to the real world, which is our own world. It's a different time period, but he introduces her to the world, and he tries to do what he thinks is best to keep her protected, which in a lot of ways means putting distance between himself and her. So she's really finding out what the world's like on her own, and she's also realizing how dark and terrible the world can be, how much injustice there is, and she's trying to decide what she even wants for herself. Is her father figure the good person she always thought he was? And what's going on with other magicians and what's going on with magic in our world? So I think it's actually a fantastic coming of age story all around, especially the element of when you sort of finally look at the world for what it is. I think that this book does that beautifully. And then last, for this particular book, we have The Queen of the Tearling. And really the main thing I'm zeroing in on is the fact that the main character was kept away from the rest of society. When The Queen of the Tearling starts, you are immediately thrust into it as our main character named Kelsey. Today is the day that she is meant to leave this place that she has been kept hidden in, and she's supposed to ascend and claim her throne. However, because of this, there are people who don't want her to have her throne, so there are enemies sent after her right from the start. She has been kept in the care of these two lovely people who are like, no, go, fulfill your destiny, basically. So she leaves, she's on the run, she has no idea what to do, she knows it's going to be an uphill battle to even get to her throne, and that's all I'll say for now. Next up, we have Fourth Wing, and obviously, of course, dragons are going to be a big element of what I'm going to recommend. I know for a lot of people, that's one of the things they loved so much about Fourth Wing. And not just the fact that there's dragons, but stories where you can bond with the dragon. There is one that's not the situation for, but two of the three, there's going to be very much a component of bonding with dragons. The first one is the most like Fourth Wing. I have said before in other videos that if you like Fourth Wing, you should try this, and that would be Fireborne. I love Fireborne. I think it is amazing. I think it does such a fantastic job of showing a post-revolution society that is trying to pick up the pieces and start something new and all the obstacles that come with that. But on top of that, the dynamic of the characters and their arcs and their place in society, their place in this new society, what their places were in the previous society, all of those things are done masterfully, and in a lot of ways there are nods to things like Plato's Republic and the classics in this. And then as the trilogy progresses, the stakes get higher and higher, and the dragon elements become more and more present. It's absolutely fantastic. I can't recommend it enough. There is a romance throughout the trilogy. There's actually a couple, and I really like the way that those are written, but it's not going to be the same kind of romance that you see in Fourth Wing. I think for me, Fireborne I mean, I love Fireborne. It's one of my favorite series of all time. I just think it balances all of the ingredients of its story so well. It has truly heartbreaking moments. It has some really serious moral questions that arise. I think it's amazing. Highly recommend. The next recommendation would be the Fireborn Blade. This is actually incredibly short, so that's also a plus, I think, if you're trying to dip your toes into fantasy. This one I would almost categorize as psychological horror fantasy, as the idea is you have a character who's trying to prove herself, which I definitely think is the case with Violet in Fourth Wing as well. But this character is trying to prove herself. She is a knight. She's trying to regain her honor, and her way of trying to do this is to go into a dragon's lair and take something from there, specifically the Fireborn Blade. And I didn't mean for two things to have the word Fireborn in them. It just so happened to work out that way. But anyway, so our character, that is her mission. But strange things are happening as she's descending into this dragon's lair. The reason I'm recommending it's not just because there's dragons, but specifically the dragons in Fourth Wing are truly dangerous dragons. And I feel like in the Fireborn Blade, you see that as well. The things that can occur when somebody gets too close to a dragon, as they get into their lairs, as they try to fight the dragons, you really recognize why you do not want to go up against one and how foolhardy it is to even try. So I think that the stakes are absolutely present in both of these. I quite like the Fireborn Blade. I thought it was certainly building off of that unique idea of dragon slaying fantasy, except for I think it did some really interesting things with it. And the last recommendation for Fourth Wing would be Ascendant. If you are looking for a story where you have a character bonding to a dragon, look no further. Ascendant is the best example of this. Oh my gosh, it's so cute. Not really a romance for you to focus on if you are looking for a romance. It's not really the situation here. But I do think that if you are in love with the idea of a character and their dragon bonding, this series is certainly going to fulfill that. In the first book, you have Holt and Ash. You also do see some other dragon riders, and there are some serious threats. In Fourth Wing, you see certain threats, but they're sort of in the distance, and then you are hearing more about them and you're learning more about them and the mysteries around them. But the dragon riders, I think that they're way in which they become dragon riders is a little bit more rooted in classism, which I thought was an interesting thing to explore. Our main character is somebody who probably should have never had access to a dragon egg or shouldn't have ever been able to bond a dragon. So you do kind of tackle what happens when the status quo is sort of broken apart. And is he a rider? Is he still a lower class person? What is he now? What vows are expected of him? Is he bound to anything? And actually that's a very fitting way to talk about the sequel, Unbound, where you actually branch out and you're seeing other dragon riders and their bonds with their dragons. The dragons certainly have their own personalities. And I just think the dragons in this are fantastic. So if that's what you're looking for, characters bonding with dragons, and there being pretty high stakes, and there being this threat of these, it's like this horde of monster, like, bug things. If that sounds appealing to you, check out Ascendant. And then last for today, we have, of course, A Court of Thorns and Roses, which is the most popular of the ones on this list. There's a few different elements that I'll be looking at for the ones I'm recommending. Some of it is the setting. Are there pieces of this that are related to Fae, or at least folklore that is associated with Fae, and also the themes throughout the story, because in A Court of Thorns and Roses, you're very much looking at Feyre as she is sort of a fish out of water. She's thrown into this new setting, and there's so much put on her shoulders, and there's so much expected of her, and she's supposed to just sort of accept it all, but then she still has this streak of independence. She still wants to be her own person, and she's trying to figure out how she fits within this new place and this new world. So the first recommendation is a pretty obvious one. Also, sometimes this gets categorized as fantasy romance because there is a rather prominent love story in this, but it's much cuter, and I would say less spicy, certainly, and that would be an Enchantment of Ravens. There's some pretty obvious parallels. Our main character is a painter, like Feyre is, and she is tasked with painting a fae. However, she paints certain emotions into the portrait she does of him, and when it's revealed to his court, the emotions are seen as proof that he is weak and not fit to rule over his court. So he whisks her into the Feyland to sort of explain herself. How could she possibly try to sabotage his rule? And she's like, hey man, I was just painting you. And so you're seeing her and him as they navigate the courts, them trying to prove themselves, her innocence, his ability to rule. And they maybe are developing feelings for each other along the way. And there's a lot of folklore elements to it as well. The next recommendation would be the Foxglove King. This is one that I personally would not have placed in fantasy romance. I have seen it categorized as fantasy romance because there are some romantic subplots in this, but I think just the fact that there's so much to the magic and there's so much to this world is why I still feel like it fits within fantasy rather comfortably. The reason I'm connecting it to ACOTAR is just the way in which our main character's stories sort of take off. At the beginning, you see our main character is just trying to get by, and then she ends up stumbling into a situation where she is suddenly thrust into a setting that she is not familiar with. Specifically in her case, she has magic associated with death, and they want her to use her magic to essentially spy on the prince. It's the king that's asking her to spy on his own son, and then she also has a guard that's assigned to her, and so she's becoming friends with these people, but she's also expected to report on them. But just that fish out of water, I'm trying to stay alive, I'm trying to still retain some of my independence, but also I gotta play the game, I think is really similar across these two stories. And then last would be the Thorns Remain. This story has fae, but in a very, very dark manner, and the main character is somebody who is grieving. And at the beginning of the story, her and her friends, they live in this very rural area, are just sort of getting by, trying to celebrate some goodness in their lives. Their lives are very difficult, and the daily pressures of life are quite demanding on them, but they're just kind of trying to take it easy. And then the fae come in, and they take her friends, and she is left behind. And everybody in the small village that she lives in thinks that everybody else has left a long time ago. They have all been tricked into believing this, and she knows it's not true. So she's trying to find a way to save all of her friends while simultaneously being involved in the grieving process and also trying to decide what she wants for her own life. And so much of that part is why I'm connecting these two. Certainly there's the fae element, but the fae in this are much more sinister and dark and controlling. And I think the controlling element, obviously a lot of people note that about ACOTAR, but with this in particular, our main character, while there are aspects of it, of the story that's sort of a metaphor for abusive relationships, I also think it's just our character trying to find her own strength, our character trying to decide what she wants for her own life, while simultaneously trying to protect people that she cares about. I think all of those reasons are why, if you like ACOTAR and Feyre and her arc, you might really like The Thorns Remain. I do want to be very clear, though, about The Thorns Remain. This is the most day-to-day kind of story. You follow the character as she does her chores. She's milking the cows, and then she's got to make dinner, and she's got to deal with the plants, and she's got to help this one neighbor, and you follow her through all this, and you're like, aren't you supposed to be trying to help your friends out? So it's very day-to-day, and it could be seen as relatively boring and dull, but I think that the themes, if you really give it time, the way in which the themes are represented in this, I think are done quite well. But anyway, that's it for if you like these fantasy romance stories. Here are some fantasy books that might be appealing to you. I'll have all these linked in the description bar in case you'd like to reference back to them or check them out. If you have any of your own recommendations for these listed, feel free to leave those in the comments down below, so that way anybody who comes to this not only has my recommendations, but yours as well. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.